Yeah, my name's Domhnall Finch, and I've been working alongside Devon Wildlife Trust and Vincent Wildlife Trust as part of the project, doing my PhD. So Fiona is my supervisor, and Fiona's gone through some of the research that we did as part of the project, and I'm just going to go on and talk about some of the other research that we did, mainly focusing on a lot of the help that we got from the project and the wonderful volunteers. So very briefly, maybe I'll get rid of that. I'm going to just talk about landscape connectivity, and then how greater horseshoes better utilise different habitat types of, and that will have many different research projects. I'm just going to discuss each different projects and then how they can be used together in softwares like Circuitscape to help us identify how bats move in the landscape and then how we can apply this research. But I do just want to say massive thank you to all of the volunteers that helped out. I know specifically just as part of the PhD, wouldn't have been possible to do it without all the help we had. I think it counted for over 1,200 hours of survey effort, over 150 volunteers just on the PhD projects. And I think they've placed over 250 bat detectors out in the landscape. So massive thank you to everyone that helped out. We really wouldn't have been able to pull off such a large scale project without the help we got. Then just to kind of recap what Fiona said, like greater horseshoes, there's many threats out in the environment, mainly roads and lighting, causing fragmentation at landscape scale. And then also we know that they're highly associated with linear features within the landscape. But what we're really interested in is how they actually use the different features in the landscape and how those different features act as barriers to their movement or else enable their movement, and whether we have some misconceptions perhaps about what we deem unsuitable habitat for the species. So just when we talk about landscape scale conservation, what are we actually talking about? What are we actually looking at in terms of scientifically examining the landscape? For this, we look at the heterogeneity of the landscape, and that's both the landscape composition and configuration. So the composition is basically the percentage coverage of each habitat within a certain area, and the configuration is how those landscape features are spatially arranged. So how features are spatially arranged, or the quantity of habitats within an area like the roost substance zones, can really influence how species move in the landscape or where you're likely to find them. So this is something that we're really interested in, is trying to examine how those features and aspects of landscape ecology actually influence the greater horseshoe bat. And as species move in the landscape, we are trying to examine them, and we look at connectivity. So connectivity can come in many different forms, from structural connectivity, which is basically how physically connected the habitats are, or the landscape features. So if you imagine a linear feature like a hedgerow, like that's structurally connected all the way until perhaps a gate is there, or a road which divides it up. And then there's functional connectivity. So that's basically, if you examine a landscape and there is a gap, what cost is incurred to the species moving across that gap? So if you imagine the road there in between the forest, and if you imagine a small mammal crossing that road, what risk is there to the mammal in crossing the road? Is there more energetic cost to crossing the road, or perhaps increased risk of predation? So these are sort of factors that we have to try and identify and implement into everyday conservation efforts, and trying to come up with solutions to help species move in the landscape. So one of the first projects that we did was we put out massive bat detectors with the volunteers did, and we helped, or we tried to put them along features, well, linear features, but every single aspect kind of within the environment, from underneath street lights to unmanaged hedgerows, managed hedgerows, along rivers, you know, in the middle of arable fields, in the middle of fields with livestock. So one of the first aspects we were interested in was looking at how bats utilise the different types of linear features. So that's managed hedgerows, unmanaged hedgerows, and tree lines. And also what the difference is in terms of activity between bat activity along linear features compared to the agricultural fields in which the linear features surround. So for this, we were able to look at many other species other than just greater horseshoe bats. So with the data we were able to collect, while we identified, I think, over 12 different species in one genus, which being Myotis, we were only able to focus on actually carry out statistical tests on 5 species groups, which is total bat activity, and then greater horseshoes, noctules, soprano pipistrelles, and common pipistrelles. So the first thing we did was looked at activity along linear features compared to in the middle of arable fields. And what we found was that about 1/5 of the activity of total bat activity occurred in the middle of agricultural fields. This varied at a species level though. About half of the activity occurred in the middle of fields compared to linear features for noctules. For both common and soprano pipistrelles, actually surprisingly high activity along linear features compared to the middle of agricultural fields. This is quite surprising because we kind of really associate them as general species, which were found everywhere from, you know, underneath streetlights in urban areas, right the way across the landscape. So it's quite interesting to see that they are mainly associated with the linear features compared to the middle center of agricultural fields. And then last but not least, the greater horseshoe, we showed that almost 1/3 of greater horseshoe activity occurs in the middle of the field. And this is really, really interesting for a species that we really do associate with linear features and along woodland edges and how they utilize those features. So it's something, and I will get into it further later, but something to really bear in mind when we look at the landscape, and perhaps we're looking at doing ecological impact assessments for new developments, stuff like that, and not just to write off the center of agricultural fields, and how maybe we should implement survey designs which encompass all aspects of the environment that we are looking to develop, I suppose. Next, using same data, we looked at different types of linear features. So we managed hedgerows, unmanaged hedgerows, and tree lines. Both noctule bats and common pipistrelles were not associated with any of the different tree line types, so they were found roughly equally along all of the 3 different features. However, soprano pipistrelles were found both are significantly more associated with tree lines and managed hedgerows, whereas greater horseshoe bats were only found to be significantly associated with tree lines. And this really comes into play when we're talking about management of the landscape and how little practical things we can implement to the landscape can really help species. So letting trees grow in the hedgerows and letting the hedgerows develop rather than cutting them every year can really help species. And this also helps other species like birds and stuff like that. So every 3 years there's is what's being found to be useful for species and increasing both floral diversity and the amount of berry crop along linear features. So they're really good for that. One of the other projects that they're currently working on at the moment is from Julie Day's PhD thesis, which, as Fiona was talking about earlier, paired up bat detectors underneath streetlights and those along linear features away from streetlights. But one of the other things that we were really interested in looking at here was how landscape features can affect the greater horseshoe bat at different scales. So please ignore my crudely drawn paint job here. What we did was around each bat detector we put buffers. So we had buffers at 50 meters, 100 meters, 250 meters, 500 meters, and 1 kilometer around the detectors. And what we then looked at was the landscape composition, the configuration within that, along with percentage cover of lights, distance to certain features like rivers and woodlands. And we put all that into statistical models. And what we found was for the first 3 buffers, so from 50 meters to 250 meters, both roads and lights significantly affected greater horseshoe activity, with lights showing decreased activity. At 500 meters buffer around the roofs, or around detector sites, we found that lights were no longer significantly associated with greater horseshoe activity, so they didn't have as big an effect, so sort of more local scale effect. And what we found was at 1 kilometer around the detectors was that lights weren't showing a significant effect either, but coniferous plantations had a negative effect on that greater horseshoe activity, or the presence of greater horseshoes in the landscape. So again, this comes back to kind of landscape scale management of the habitats around greater horseshoe roosts in the roost subsistence zones, but as Fiona was shown, much wider in the South Hams stack, kind of joining up the roosts. It's really important to kind of think of what habitats are available, what are there, and what are actually causing the impacts for greater horseshoe bats. And next, with some great help from volunteers around Buckfastleigh and mainly Chudley, we wanted to look at how it was the A roads, so the A38 in this case, really how that was impacting bat activity. And what we did here was we put back detectors 50 meters, 100 meters, 250 meters, and 500 meters from the roads going out along features. And we got mixed results. So the first year we did it, we got really nice results showing that the roads, this on the left graph, sorry, and that activity was dramatic. This total bat activity was dramatically reduced in close proximity roads. However, the second year we did it, we got mixed results, kind of not really showing any trends. And this is something that we need to progress further. And it shows the complexity within the environment. So perhaps we need to focus more on survey design and looking at what features we also put detectors at, to try and incorporate the different aspects of the environment into the study. But this was great work done by volunteers, mainly around Chudley, which is great help. It's really, really interesting work, which we will progress further later on in the year or next year even. But then trying to incorporate all of the different aspects of the research that we did, from looking at traffic noise and its negative impacts, the impact of street lighting, and how useful linear features can be, or the negative effects of coniferous plantations. As I said at the talk, we're really interested in how the spatial aspect of those features and the percentage of those features within the landscape can influence the movement of greater horseshoe bats. So for this, we use all the research behind showing what greater horseshoes like, what they utilize, and what they dislike. We put all of that into a predictive software called CircuitScape. And that basically uses an electrical current in the environment, and you basically go from your roost outwards, and as it passes through the environment, those features such as roads or streetlights, which have a negative effect, have higher resistance scores in the landscape. So they're less permeable to the movement of the species, and act as a barrier basically. So this will basically be able to allow us to predict how the species kind of move or utilize the environment, showing areas of functional connectivity, and where we might want to implement practical conservation measures. So these are kind of just an example of the resistance scores. You can see here that the black is kind of lower resistance, so it's more permeable to species movement, whereas white, such as the buildings and arable fields, are less permeable, so higher resistance. For this, as I said, we created resistance maps, and then we input the roost locations, and then where the energy is trying to get to. So we put circles around the roosts every 100 meters out for 3 kilometers. We input this into Circuitscape and we get a current map. Just kind of squiggly lines here, which I'll go into now. And this is around Buckfast Lee. And you can see the areas of high functional connectivity here are the blue. So blue is good. It's what the bats are utilising, and red is bad. And you can see Buckfast Lee, or Buckfast town here. You can see all the streetlights having a negative effect on the movement of the bats. Whereas the linear features going out in the landscape, such as the tree lines and unmanaged hedgerows, really have a positive effect on the movement of the species. And just kind of zoom in more, I'm going to give a case study kind of one of the streetlights, streetlit areas around town. Just move on. You can see here individual streetlights, which is the black triangles. And in this case, actually, it's switched around, so red is good in this case. But you can see how the streetlights have a huge impact on the movement or the predicted movement of greater horseshoe bats. And using these sorts of softwares and zooming in on these areas, we can really isolate individual streetlights and individual features which have a negative impact. So if we're looking to implement practical conservation measures, we perhaps don't need to remove a whole street of streetlights, but perhaps look at just implementing measures or turning off one particular streetlight, which could have huge implications of how the species actually utilize the landscape and have higher conservation benefits without having a lot of human-wildlife conflicts as such. Again, this is just kind of another example of how we could utilize the landscape features. And this is Braunton Town, and these are the buildings within it. But and there's a road going north-south here. And one of the things that we were really interested in was how the greater horseshoes were moving through the landscape. And we knew they were crossing the road. The roost is just up here, directly north of this image. But how the roosts or the bats were actually crossing the road, or where they were crossing the road. So Circuitscape predicted that this area here in the yellow rectangle was where the bats were crossing the road. And what we did was we put out bat detectors at these points and in both north and south of these points. And lo and behold, the models were correct. We had the highest percentage of bats crossing the road at this location compared to any detectors north or south of it. So it really highlights the use of these models. And again, if you're looking to implement any sort of practical measures, like getting rid of one of these street lights, which wouldn't have a negative effect for the roads, it could really benefit the bats. Another example which we didn't really think about was Circuitscape highlighted areas that we didn't think were suitable for the movement of the greater horseshoe bats. So in this rectangle here, it's right the way through the middle of Braunton Town, and this area is highly densely populated, kind of lots of streets, street lights, street houses, cars, lots of noise, traffic. So we didn't really think that it would be that suitable for the greater horseshoes. But again, we put out bat detectors in these locations and did pick up low numbers of greater horseshoes traveling across these areas compared to west and east of it, where we didn't have any horseshoes. So this really shows that it can highlight areas that you may not think are suitable for the movement of the species, but can have huge effects. If we're looking to create a dark corridor to connect north and south of Braunton Town, this might be a really good location to do it. And again, if we're looking to connect up the landscape, we might look at developing landscape features. So if we imagine going directly diagonal across here, instead of what looks like a managed hedgerow here, if you're looking to put in a tree line or just let the hedgerow grow out. This could really just connect up these two areas of high functional connectivity, really increasing the species movement within the landscape. What's also important to consider is not just what we perceive as suboptimal habitats. So the image here is there's an arable field in the foreground and in the background, and then there's an intensely managed, it's only about knee height linear feature going through the centre of the two of them. And if you're looking to put in development, it might be really, really good to put in development in this area in terms of rather than doing it in the woodland behind it, where there's a really nice river, or taking out the tree line to the right of it. So this looks like a really nice area to develop, in terms of what you can be developed in the landscape. But using Circuscape, it highlighted this as being this linear feature, being a really important feature of high functional connectivity in the landscape. And again, when we put up bat detectors along this feature, we got higher greater horseshoe activity along this feature compared to the woodland edge behind it and the river within that woodland again behind it. So this just shows the importance of this one feature in this landscape and really highlights the importance of what features come before an individual area and what features come after it. So this area before and after is really good connectivity. The greater horseshoes are really going along this connectivity and then pushing along this managed hedgerow to get into the wider landscape further west of this. So it really highlights how what seems unsuitable might actually be really, really important at a landscape scale, and how we need to consider these features in the wider landscape rather than just looking at a local level or inside the red line boundary of a development. And in using these, it can be really, really useful then to look at a landscape scale and trying to identify where the pinch points are in the landscape, and at a planning level where we might want to create green corridors which protect biodiversity rather than continuous urban sprawl across the landscape. So trying to identify these areas before time is really, really important, not just at a local level, but at a landscape scale, so that we can allow, particularly the greater horseshoes around the South Hams area, move between the roosts and move between hibernation sites as well. So this is really, really important when we talk about landscape scale conservation of the species. And just kind of very briefly, I'm going to touch on what Fiona mentioned earlier in relation to bat activity in terms of distance to roosts. So this is a log scale, but roughly equates to just kind of in the first 500 meters away from the roost, you roughly get about 50 bat passes a night. And then at about 1 kilometer from the roost, this drops down to about 10%. And then about 2 kilometers from the roost, it drops down again. It could be about 2 to 5 bat passes a night. And then after that, you're talking about 0 and 1s. So it really highlights how we think about the distance to the roost and how that needs to be perceived in terms of when we're saying that there's low bat activity, and what the cumulative effect of taking out hedgerows, that even though they only have 1s or 2s bat passes per night at 2 kilometers from a roost, can still be really, really important to the wider movement of the species. But the cumulative effect of all these features within the landscape really what we need to focus on in terms of conservation of the species. So just very briefly to summarize, linear features such as unmanaged hedgerows and tree lines are really, really important for not only greater horseshoe bats, but all bat species in the landscape. Street lighting can really have a negative effect at a local scale, particularly on movement of the greater horseshoe bat and their activity. As Fiona was mentioning earlier, we need to kind of think about where these where the lighting is occurring, in that having them on minor roads or along footpaths or walkways or river corridors could have a much wider or a greater negative impact on bat species compared to having them along a motorway. So it's just kind of something to think about when we're looking at a local planning level. But hope through the use of all these experiments and the work that the volunteers have done, we've been able to identify what is important and implement them or incorporate them into Stethoscope, which hopefully we'll be able to use as a visual tool for planning. So we'd really love to have this made available, really available online, that we can implement, put over the different areas, the different roost sites, so that people can have access to it and see what is important for the great horseshoe bats. And really try to identify the pinch points in the landscape and where might be really critical in terms of implementing practical conservation measures and how we can apply that to their conservation. And then it's just kind of really to focus on and think about planning for the future and get ready now, kind of, rather than each individual development being taught locally at a local level. We need to start planning at a landscape scale to try and incorporate and dark corridors into our landscape scale planning. But yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for everyone that helped out on the project. Thank you.